In Syria's civil war, there are some developments. Russia, Turkey, and Iran have agreed to a deal aimed at trying to ratchet down some of the fighting.
But the three powers back rival sides in the six-year-long war, and Syrian forces and its allies are still engaged in intense clashes around the country. Our senior Middle East correspondent Mohammed Al-Qasim has the latest.
A breakthrough for the 6.5-year Syrian civil war. An agreement was reached to establish a fourth de-escalation zone in Idlib province in northern Syria. The deal, brokered by Russia, Turkey, and Iran, calls for an end to hostilities between the Syrian forces and the armed opposition. Three other de-escalation zones were agreed on previously in different parts of Syria, and the two-day talks are the sixth round of negotiations Moscow is spearheading. Russia is a major ally of Syrian President Bashar al-Assad, but no agreement was reached on which forces would be deployed in the Idlib de-escalation zone, which includes territory under the control of a Syrian rebel alliance led by a former Al-Qaeda affiliate, the Al-Nusra Front. The Astana talks have been much more successful than the UN-sponsored Geneva talks, and they focus on ceasefire agreements between Syrian warring parties. And elsewhere in Syria, fierce clashes continue between pro-government forces and members of the so-called Islamic State group. Russia's military intervention in Syria has been crucial in keeping President Assad in power. Assad's forces and allies have been making significant gains on the ground in the past year, strengthening his hand at the negotiation table. The seventh round of Astana talks is scheduled for the end of October. Mohammed Al-Qasim, I-24 News.
To further discuss the situation in Syria, let's bring in Matthew Brodsky. He's a senior fellow at the Security Studies Group. Matthew, good to have you with us. And Matthew, this ceasefire agreement reached for the Idlib zone, how significant is that?
Well, it was predictable given the path that Turkey is on, which is basically to make some common cause with Russia and Iran, who they're historic enemies, of course. But this is significant in that it further allows Assad to consolidate power to the east. The Idlib province is where there still are Nusra Front-aligned terrorist groups and other rebel groups that are still active there, and that's also along where the Russian Sea and New Air Base are. This is a very active place that Iran and Russia have very specific goals there. And it's also, of course, close to a Kurdish enclave that Turkey would like to deal with. I think in the end, Turkey will end up getting the short end of the stick in any deal it makes there or otherwise in Syria with Russia and Iran. But those are the cards it chooses to play.
Matthew, also possible that the cards would not be very good for the opposition groups, since every previous ceasefire agreement, Syria's government forces have used that break to essentially refortify, stock up on new supplies, and then put their troops in places where they can continue to make more advances.
Oh, absolutely. I mean, from a meeting that I've had a few months ago when it came to Syria and Syrian forces, they kind of were joking from senior officials who were joking about whether the Syrian army would be able to actually work against ISIS in the east of Syria. Well, you know, it turns out after a few months that if you have several ceasefires, even if you have 20,000 troops, it gives them enough time to consolidate their power and move across the country and engage with ISIS. So this works out perfectly for Assad, and will go perfectly. It'll be perfect for Iran and Russia and their goals. It doesn't, though, fit with Turkey's long-term strategic goal, which was still to see the end of Assad. But Turkey fears the Kurdish question far more than he fears Assad.
Now, Matthew, it does seem like Assad is making progress, making gains. How do you see this playing out for him?
For him, there's no reason to think that anything would change. You know, the big wild card in all of this is the Trump administration and what it decides to do, not only with the Iran nuclear deal, but how it decides that it's going to push back against Iran and exactly what that's going to look like. And also, I mean, this is a big issue in that the United States has really has been in favor of, through the previous administration, of boosting Iran throughout the entire region. And that's something that this administration has really yet to challenge and change. So if we continue in this direction, Assad is going to gain control of Syria. It's going to be a state essentially run on the ground by Iran, and Russia gets to play the kingmaker. That's not in the West's interest.
You mean giving more power to Iran by inaction? In other words, if you ask the administration, they would say, look, we're not in favor of supporting Iran in any fashion, but the fact that the Trump administration seems somewhat disengaged from Syria policy, from trying to make it clear to U.S. allies and even rivals what exactly the Trump red line would be.
That's exactly right. They see ISIS in Syria as their only goal. And to the extent anyone can help defeat ISIS, then that's great. I don't think that they've taken account of the fact that Syria is the missing piece of the puzzle for Iran when it comes to not only its land bridge, but, you know, exuding its power throughout the entire region. That is a major advantage for Iran. And to the extent the United States does nothing, just like you say, it plays to Iran's advantage.
Well, the president did reportedly receive reports suggesting a more aggressive U.S. stance against Iran, but it didn't include Syria. It didn't include boosting U.S. presence in Syria or U.S.-led coalition troops in Syria. How critical is that, then?
Right. From my perspective, it's critical. I mean, you can discuss troop levels, but what happens in Syria is critical. So a plan to address that and so that it comes to out in America's favor is definitely important. What the administration is more looking at doing is playing around with the Iran deal to decertify the deal in October, to stick within the deal, and to apply sanctions outside of the nuclear issue so that they're not really destroying the deal. But unless there's a plan to push back kinetically on Iran throughout the region, it's going to come up short, because these gains that can be made can be permanent for Iran. And this is something they've sought ever since the revolution.
Matthew Brodsky, Senior Fellow at the Security Studies Group. Matthew, thanks for doing this. We appreciate it.
Anytime.
The United Nations held an emergency session on North Korea today. We'll tell you what came out of that meeting.
Plus, the U.S. ambassador to the United Nations, Nikki Haley, raised some eyebrows when she said that the U.S. would have no problem letting Defense Secretary Jim Mattis deal with North Korea.